Good morning. I just wanted to make sure you're all awake. Let me first acknowledge my presence on the sacred land and my privilege of being able to speak here. Let me also acknowledge the organizing committee's very, very kind and generous invitation to come and talk at something that Richard and I experienced for the first time in Church House next to Westminster Abbey. Let me also thank the University of Otago for sponsoring my presence. And let me thank all of you who are here today for what you're contributing to what we believe has to be system change in our healthcare world. It's a very difficult task, and I've been privileged over the years to meet many, many people who are dedicated, and I mean dedicated, to the cause, and I'd like to acknowledge them. There are a number of them here today, but they do span the globe. And I am going to dedicate my talk to three very special people. Hugh Barr, who is now having renal, whatever, 3 times a week. Maddie Schmidt, who has been an absolute inspiration for all of us as a copy editor, but also as an instructor. And to Bud Baldwin, who will be, I think, 97 this year, who is still working. So I dedicate my talk today to those 3 people who've been very, very special to me. I chose as the topic a journey about the culture which has been developing around interprofessional education for collaborative person-centered practice. And I am a great disciple of Karl Popper, and some of you will know that for many years of my life, until I saw the wrongness of my ways, I was a real empiricist. And the empiricism used to drive certain people nuts until I said, it's okay, I'm beginning to see the light. Now, Karl Popper, of course, gave us, now I have to remember which of these things gets me forward. Oh, this one. Yes. Karl Popper essentially told us that we will make conjectures, which are really hypotheses, which are in a null form, and that we will reject them with data. And so when I was invited to talk about interprofessional transformation, are we making a difference? I look back at those 2 questions that were asked of Bud and Maddie at the first of these meetings. And I thought about how to phrase those questions in a slightly different way as conjectures, and then present you with what I think is a refutation of a terrible article that was published earlier this year, which I will get to at the end of this talk. So we're going to look at these 5 questions, and let me point out that what I'm going to talk about is going to be linear in the sense of the slides I'm going to show you, but they are all interacting with each other. Is there more learning together? Are there new forms? Are safety and quality of care improving? Are new management structures steering change? And is the transformational steering the management, is the transformation steering the management to change? And actually, if you look at these questions, think on them, they are embedding the KP definition of interprofessional education. Now, what I wanted to do was to explore the culture that we've been developing over the last 20 years People who have written about the history of interprofessional education always say, well, we've been doing it for about 70 years, and then the real cynics saying there's no evidence, right? I don't want to go there today. I don't want to go to that place. I don't want to give you repeated analysis of variance on two factors. I do not want to give you a chi-square. I do not want to give you a p-value, so you won't get any of that. No numbers, okay? Except there are numbers. I am going to show you a lot of pictures, so be prepared, because we're going to go through them about a minute at a time. It's the old pekokichu, you know, the Japanese way of doing stuff. So culture, my good friend Jill Thistlethwaite has written about this. Culture is what we have been developing over the last 20 years. And culture is living and thinking, praising, etc., the knowledge, values, and norms. And if you look at the posters, because I can't go to all the sessions, but I have been at every poster, you will see this emerging. It's very, very interesting, emerging. So this wonderful slide here, I owe to my colleague from Manipal University, who is here today, because it's hanging in their classroom. And I said, oh, I'd like a picture that shows interprofessional and all of the things that are around it, because this is the culture, okay? Now, history is really interesting. It did not begin yesterday. So look back. This is a wonderful picture. 1956, uploading the first 5 megabyte hard drive. Can you imagine that? And now today, 1 terabyte on that little drive. 1 terabyte. That is historical change, and that is the change that our culture is about. We are not stuck 20 years ago. We're not stuck because of the work you're doing, the work your colleagues are doing, the work that's being done around the world, and the work that our wonderful dear friend Scott was engaged in. So if you look back to 1972, educating the health team, notice that it was the health team, and then look forward to leading by example when we're actually talking about accreditation. That's a huge leap, right? A huge leap. So, first question, is interprofessional transformation leading to more learning together? So here's the CAPE definition. And actually, the latest iteration has its students and members of health professions added, which is very sensible. And quality of care is not only about the patient, but it's also about the services. And I think those are 2 extremely good additions, because it makes the definition even more testable. So, is the transformation leading to more learning together? Okay. The first thing we began thinking about was the built environment. You know, how can we put students together to learn together so that they will learn to work together? And we really did look at the academic environment without recognizing that in the practice environment, these built environments have been going on for ages and ages. So we have diabetic clinics, you know, we have COPD clinics, we have rheumatoid clinics, et cetera, et cetera. But it was important, very important for us to think about how are we going to put people together so that they learn together. And that has still a piece of our consciousness that is not yet completed. So my good friend, Professor Manipur at Manipal, says, the built environment, all the structures people have built when considered as separate from natural and surroundings created by humans to be used by human activity. So we have to think about how the architects think about the built environment if we're going to think about the built environment for students, okay? If we're going to make change. So he asked the question, and I asked the question of him, where do we learn so that we think about those built environments? So it's the classrooms, the spaces, which are not classrooms, projects. It was great to see the students yesterday on one of the healthcare teams kind of sitting in the lobby doing the built environment, contributing to their ability to be able to work together prior to doing whatever it is they're going to do. Very exciting today. Then workplaces and forums, etc. So where to learn is not just one place. And at the beginning, we got kind of locked into thinking of the built environment as some individual space where it was going to be specially constructed, but it isn't. There are lots of different places that are the built environment for learning, okay? Now, some very exciting things have happened. Ball State University in Indiana opened this building in June. And by the way, if you look at your app, they're advertising for somebody to be the director of interprofessional education. It's a beautiful building. In fact, one of my classmates, when I was a graduate student at Purdue University, was the president of Ball when it was building this building. Halifax, University of Halifax, where I have an adjunct appointment, put a huge amount of time, effort, and energy into thinking about and building this collaborative health education building. It's a beautiful space, all right? And they had the opportunity to look back and then to think forward about what the space should look like. And the same in Toronto at George Brown College, where this building is on the waterfront. Thinking about the classroom space as well as the kind of other spaces in which people can work, okay? So the academic built environment has had a lot of attention paid to it, but to our shame, we haven't really thought about how do we translate and transfer that learning environment into the practice environment so that our colleagues, our coworkers, our facilitators in the practice setting can share their work environment in ways which enhance the learning. Now, we moved to educational change in 2010 because of this very significant paper in the Lancet, Health Professionals for a New Century. And it was kind of weird that, well, I'll get to that in just a moment. But then that was translated into the work that was being done at the WHO. This was a hugely important step in building the culture. Think about now, as we go through the rest of the slides, think about the number of people who have to be engaged in order to produce something like this, talking maybe in a kind of abstract way about interprofessional education, and then translating it over here at the WHO, where another group of people are doing that kind of work. Huge numbers. So think about the numbers of people engaged in this and the number of people who were engaged in developing and designing those buildings. Interprofessional, the culture, building that culture by talking with each other about the spaces, talking with each other about curriculum, etc., okay? And then this wonderful report measuring the impact of interprofessional education. Barbara Brandt was a member of this particular committee. Again, a huge consultation process. And the same over here, promising interprofessional collaborative practices from the Robert Wood Johnson, 2015. That was only 3 years ago. But think of the number of people who are engaged in talking about interprofessional education, and the number of consultations that had to go out in order to do it. That's a lot of people joining the culture, okay? And then, as we began to think seriously about the curriculum, we said, didn't we all say that we were no longer going to norm reference people to get into any kind of health professional program, but we were going to actually look at competencies? So what did we do? The Canadian Professional Health Collaborative produced its competencies in 2010, and the Americans a year later, and then had a revision. The competencies are still not perfect, but imagine, I can tell you from the Canadian perspective and from, I think, from the American perspective, the number of people that are involved in talking about this is building the culture, okay? You can't really put numbers on. You can't just say, we're going to do a quantitative analysis, a BEME or a Cochrane or whatever on this. Not yet, because that is basis of the culture that we want. Very, very, very important step forward. Very important. Now, as we got those competencies in place, people really did begin to think about translating curricula into a competency framework. So my colleagues at the University of Montreal use the competency framework, and they are going to translate their curriculum, this curriculum approach, into English, I hope, very soon. But I was visited by a friend and colleague of mine from Thailand earlier this year. Thailand has just written a wonderful interprofessional competency-based curriculum. Think of the number of people, French-speaking, on this side who are involved in building the culture, and think of the number of people on this side speaking Thai who are building the culture, and then think of the other places where this is. The numbers are enormous. You don't get that captured if you try to do a quant analysis on does it work. Then, thanks to KP, well, actually, I think our journal actually preceded KP, didn't it? Well, maybe they were in time. But anyway, what you see is the true basis of an academic discipline, the development of a place where people can share their ideas, their concepts, their vision of what it is that interprofessional education for collaborative person-centered practice is. So we have 3 journals now. We have JIC, JIEP in the United States, JRIPE in Canada. Ours is a strictly open access journal. And think of the number of people, because there are a number of you here who are involved, in reviewing the JIC. Think of that. Think of the number of papers that come in to JIC that get rejected. Now, just because they get rejected is not a bad thing, because it tells us that there is that community out there, that culture that is building around a notion. Okay? The same is true of the other 2 journals. So this is a very, very important academic step. And when I was first introduced by Hugh to JIC, I think we were publishing maybe 3 issues a year. And I think at that time, I don't think we had more than about 8 papers in each issue. Have you looked at the latest issue? Have you looked at the latest year for JIC? It's amazing. It's just amazing. So think about the people. The culture is building, okay? Now, is IP transformation leading to new forms of collaboration? So I said these are overlapping questions. Mattie, with her colleague, wrote this amazing article in 1988, Coordination, Cooperation, Collaboration. Have you walked around the posters? You will see coordination, cooperation, collaboration over and over and over again. It is amazing, right? Because when we started, we were really thinking about cooperation. Mattie says, you know, the coordination went on in the office, but we were thinking about cooperation, and then that moved into this notion of collaboration. So, is the transformation leading to new forms? Well, the WHO, with whom I've worked now for quite a while, has moved the landscape around social determinants of health. And it's very interesting that when you look at this quasi-Venn diagram, and then we can have lots and lots of discussion about this, and we can have lots of discussion about all of the slides. There just isn't time at the moment, okay? But when you look, what we're trying to do now is not to think about the patient in the center of a circle of providers, but really the person with the issues in this much larger landscape of the determinants, of the environment, okay? So think about the number of people who are engaged in putting that together. We just finished the electronic book on the social determinants of health. Is coming out in November. And the basis of teaching interprofessional education, teaching social determinants is interprofessional education. Okay? So this is a very interesting development because the patient's not a hockey puck, not a football, not a whatever, all right? And there's a lot of discussion going on, and we'll get to this in just a moment, around whether we're placing too much emphasis on putting the patient in the middle instead of thinking about it a slightly different way. We can have another conversation about that. But look what is happening. This is a wonderful organization of German, Austrian, and Swiss experts. We were talking a little about this yesterday at WCC meeting. A committee for interprofessional education in the health professions. Think of the number of people now speaking a totally different language from English. Okay? It's amazing. So the culture is pushing out in a lot of different ways. So this organization has done some very interesting work, still is doing some very interesting work, and we hope will be joined with the WCC. But then, I found this the other day. This has only just come out. The American College of Surgeons has a committee on interprofessional education and practice. What does that mean about the culture? Think about it. It's amazing. The College of Surgeons? With all due respect to the surgeons among us, okay? I mean, this is truly amazing. And then look at the goals. Think about it. Then the students. So, of course, they were the kind of end organ of all of this. And we didn't give them much. We said, come and do it, and we'll give you something new to do, et cetera, et cetera. But it's amazing how the students have contributed. Now, they're not going to change that. Somebody said they should. They're not going to change the healthcare system. But they have made an amazing contribution. And think of the number of students that we are educating now in a somewhat different way. Not perfect. We're not going to get there yet because we don't have the culture complete, okay, if ever. But the Canadian Student Leaders' Perspective on Interprofessional Education Consensus, this is a lovely article, by the way, but look at the number of students on it. That's the culture. And then look at report from KP on the student Twitter. This was a wonderful piece of work. I love that, the culture, right? And then we have at Dalhousie University something called Dalmising, which I think is great. It's like a super duper interprofessional team collaboration, etc. Then we have the Healthcare Team Challenge. I'll bet you don't know that the Healthcare Team Challenge started at the University of British Columbia. And I bet you don't know that it used to be called the Healthcare Team Competition. And I bet you don't know that John Gilbert said, health is not a competition, it's a collaboration. So he changed it to challenge. In the United States, we had Clarion in Minnesota, wonderful, wonderful student-led, or student-organized and student-led, interactive kind of team challenge. And then, of course, globally now we have the healthcare team. So the students, the people that we want to walk out through the door and change the system are getting there. Huge numbers. Think of the culture. Now, we are also transforming through social networks. Altogether Better Health has its website, which we are reworking. Then there's the Collaborating Across Borders. Both of those meetings are really large. At our last Collaborating Across Borders meeting in Alberta, I think Charlotte could tell me, I think we had about 720. When it was in Roanoke in Virginia, the meeting before that, we had close to 850 people. So the meetings are important. Visits to IPE websites, we get at our website every week, probably at, 250, 300 visits. Posts on Facebook, I post to Facebook every day, and I have the Google, search. In the last 5 years, I have put up on our Facebook site every day at least 2 stories about interprofessional education. Now, they're not all great, but think of that cultural change. Every day. I just looked at my global search this morning. There are 5 stories. Now, some of them are kind of rubbishy, but it doesn't matter. The word is there. The culture is kind of getting there, all right? And then the Twitter. I mean, it's great to see, what's happening here. I Twitter every day because I'm sending out stuff. So the social network is really important, the likes on Facebook. And then YouTube. If you go to YouTube and you look for interprofessional stuff, it's amazing. It's just amazing how many things are there. Think of the people and think of the reach. Think of the culture that's being built by that. Blogs, I don't see many blogs, but I do see some. And that's maybe an effective way of building the culture. But I think we have a huge possibility in podcasts, okay? Because you don't need to be sitting looking at something. You know, I listen to podcasts when I'm out on my 2.5-mile walk every day. It's great. So the transformation through social networks is really impressive. The culture is building. Now, is it leading to improved safety, quality care? Remember the last part of the KP definition, right? So I sit on the BC Patient Safety and Quality Council because I talk about interprofessional, right? And it's amazing what is happening around safety. Now, I wonder if you know that the first checklist came out of this accident, B-17 accident. Fascinating, huh? Because people will talk about a checklist, they don't know where it came from. And then look at the checklist, well, it's not very distinct, but the checklist says all these things like make sure the switch is down, make sure the switch is up, have you got the window open, is the window closed, where's your ratchet, et cetera, et cetera. And when you think about how airline safety has kind of come into the healthcare system, and then how we, the interprofessional community, have been using this as a teaching mechanism, it's truly amazing. The safety quality culture now has this thread through it of working collaboratively together, which is really interprofessional, okay? So then when we look at, you know, what has come out of the big safety initiatives, patient identification. Oh, do I have the right band? Is it your name and is your doctor's name on the band? Remember this one? No, it was on the other wrist, and it wasn't my doctor, it was somebody else's doctor. They took my left arm off instead of my right arm. Okay, communication at handoffs. It's a wonderful area for interprofessional exploration. I had a graduate student at Simon Fraser University who looked at just this issue. What happens at handoff? With respect to safety for the next crew coming on in the acute, okay? Safe storage of medications. The cart's on the 3rd floor, we need it on the 5th floor. Why is it on the 3rd floor? Because we don't have enough people to move them around, okay? But we spent a lot of time thinking of this. Team participation in surgical timeouts, huge issue. Hand hygiene. You thought we had this solved, right? Ha! We've got about a 65% rate in British Columbia. Falls prevention, hugely, and if you look at the work that's being done in physio, OT, et cetera, around fall, it's very, very, very interprofessional. Think of the number of people who are doing this. And then, of course, clinical documentation. We all know about adverse events. We all know about adverse events that arise because of problems in clinical documentation. And then, of course, out of the safety quality thing comes the patient's voice. When I was very young, we used to go to the physician, the local doctor, and we sit around in this room, deadly silent. Sometimes it was deadly silent. Deadly silent. Nobody ever asked us, you know, about how we felt about our physician, how we felt about the healthcare service, et cetera, et cetera. But once we actually went into the safety quality arena, then it became very clear that we better start listening to ourselves as patients, because we're all patients here. It's not a special group of people that we kind of work with. We're all patients, okay? So in the University of British Columbia, 10 years ago, no, it's more than 10 years ago, we had the first conference on Where's the Patient's Voice. And Jill's written a lovely article about the 10-year follow-up of this. Now, the output of that conference in Canada was the development of the Patient Voices Network, which is when we began to hear this, I'm not in the middle, I am part of your team. Hugely, hugely important. And as we thought about that, we said, that really is interprofessional. Think of the numbers. They are huge. The culture, the patient voice culture, as it contributes to our understanding. In Canada now, any research grant has to have the patient voice present as it's being written from the ground up, okay? So the patient's voice then is leading us to this next question, which is it leading to new management structures? And this is quite difficult, I think. So Dona Bedian's famous article, Evaluating the Quality of Medical Care, certainly, inspires me still. Structure, process, outcome. If you look, and again, I can't go to all the sessions to hear what you're saying, but if I look at the posters, you can see structure, process, outcome, all being explored in very many interesting ways. Think of the numbers who are developing this kind of view of the culture. It's amazing. Now, with respect to curriculum, this has been a very, very interesting problem with respect to building the culture. So our colleagues in Australia have done an enormously important job nationally on curriculum renewal, and I'd like to acknowledge that. It is very impressive what our Australian colleagues are able to do on a national basis. We can't do it in Canada because we don't have a federal Ministry of Education. We have provincial. But I'm very impressed in how that has come in to look at the way in which the curricula should be organized. And again, think of the numbers. Think of that culture. I know I speak with a number of our Australian colleagues, and I know there's frustration, but get past the frustration and say, gosh, just think what we've accomplished. It's just, and there's another iteration of this. And then an issue that is now becoming much clearer and on which we are working is continuing professional competence, right? So now we're thinking beyond the classroom of undergraduates through the work environment into what are we going to do to ensure that the next generation of healthcare professionals of all ilks, okay? We should really talk about health occupations because I think the cleaners are really important in the acute care sector. But when we think about the culture which is building around trying to take interprofessional education beyond, pre-licensure into continuing learning, it's really very interesting. Think of the people involved in that. Now, if we look at post-secondary, I apologize to Dr. David Allen, but I found this absolutely fascinating. This is a little video that you can find on YouTube. David Allen is talking about the growing importance of interprofessional education. This is the School of Pharmacy. Who would have thought it? You remember when we used to say, well, pharmacists, they just count the pills and put them in the bottle. They don't anymore. I'm really impressed at the way in which pharmacy in my country and in the United States has kind of joined this effort to become part of the interprofessional collaborative team. Get out from behind the counter, get in front of the patient, talk about the pill. Okay. Now, then, as we've looked at the way in which we had organized KP and then CIC, AIHC, etc., you begin to see the development around the globe. It's absolutely fascinating. So global organizations have come into play in some very interesting ways. And we had a very interesting little workshop yesterday on work that's being done in PAHO. But these are reports that are written now, not in the English-speaking world, but in some other language. Think of the numbers of people who are involved. They won't be vast, but just think of the number involved in developing that culture in a culture. And then we got to thinking about, how are we going to manage accreditation? If I could deep six something in this world, I'd deep six accreditation. And we have we talked about this in one of our sessions today, right? So we have a real problem with accreditation. Does it hold us back? Well, yeah, it does in many ways, because everybody wants to make sure their accreditation standards are correct. But we have worked on accreditation in Canada. I know that many others of you are working on it. We had a very good committee that worked for a couple of years and produced a report. And I think that it had some effect, but it's all very well writing, we will do interprofessional education in our curriculum in medicine, nursing, pharmacy, da-da-da-da-da-da. but where's the evidence? This is a very difficult problem. And I can understand why, I understand why it's a difficult problem. But then I looked on the web when I was looking up some work that had been done in AFI, and I found the Accreditation Council in Continuing Medical Education in the United States has just put up this particular piece about interprofessional collaborative practice. Isn't that great? Again, the Accreditation Council is a big organization in the United States. Think of the number of people that must have been involved in coming up with this wording. That's the culture. And then we said, well, it's all very well having accreditation, but if you really want to change the system, we'd better work on legislation. And we have a colleague here from University of Montreal who gave a wonderful talk yesterday about the legal aspects that we've kind of hedged around and so on. But in Nova Scotia, which is a long way from British Columbia, Nova Scotia put together the Regulated Health Professions Network, and part of the network's mandate, you can see under A, to enable an increase in interprofessional practice. Think of the number of people, I keep saying this, think of the number of people who had to be engaged in order to write that paragraph. It's amazing. So the culture then is moving. It's moving in a way that we've seen profession, practice moving, okay? The culture for interprofessional, it's getting into the work. Now, then of course, as we looked at how to do this in various ways in various places for various reasons with no money, what we see appearing are centers. I have lost count of the number of centers that there are for interprofessional education collaboration. It's quite amazing. And where they are, all right? The centers are both in academic settings, by which you mean on a university or college campus, but they're also centers in practice. And as those centers have developed, what we see happening is professorships and directorships, which are specifically about interprofessional education. Can you imagine, well, you will because I bet you're all engaged in this, can you imagine the amount of conversation I have to have with a dean, with the vice president, academic, to talk about establishing a center for interprofessional education collaborative practice in your institution? It's huge. He'll say, well, have you talked to agriculture? Have you talked to theology? Oh, and by the way, did you talk to engineering? And every time you talk to each of those domains, they say, so tell me a bit more about it. Think of the culture, right? And then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's the way in which management is being organized in order to organize interprofessional education is really, really remarkable. And as we have deliberated the future health professional, we've had to think about the health workforce. Because what is clearly apparent is that we can't go on training more and more and more of the same. Because what we have found over the last 60 years is that training more and more and more of the same appears not to solve the workforce problem. So the global strategy, 2016, WHO, really, really interesting piece of work. Workforce 2030 is kind of guiding a lot of my thinking now about where we take interprofessional education, and then framing the health workforce agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, the Sustainable Development Goals are taken very seriously by the WHO and by others. And we don't talk about them very much in our meetings, and we need to talk about them because that's a culture we need to really influence. Because if we want to develop a better system for health provision, we're not going to do it by producing more and more people who are doing this instead of doing this, right? And then the National Workforce Accounts is an excellent document produced last year, WHO, and again has IPE in it. This has IPE in it, and I won't ask you to guess why it's in there. Okay, is IP transforming, steering the management of change? So if you haven't looked at Hugh's paper, Interprofessional Education, the Genesis of the Global Movement, I recommend it. It's online, you can read it. Hugh's done an amazing job of looking at more than 50 countries, because there's more now since Hugh wrote the paper, okay? And just that we have 20 plus at this meeting. Again, now even if there's only one of you from one country, that's the culture, right? So when you look at that, and then you look at the BME's systematic reviews, don't be dismayed when they say, we looked at 2,455 articles and we got 22 of them that looked like they actually produced data for change. Don't be disturbed by that. Think about the number of articles that were reviewed that had something that said they were about interprofessional education. Think about that. The number of people, not the ones that look like they really are giving you data for change. Because we're thinking about the culture. We're not thinking about the quant, right? This is not about quantitative stuff. And then the mechanisms for making those changes, like this meeting, but webinars. Really an amazing way of getting the message out. This is for our colleagues in South America. And this was a webinar that I think Ava, did you do this webinar? I think you did. Anyway, yeah, you did, yeah. So the webinar is getting to audiences in ways that we've not been able to do it. So AIHC does amazing webinars. My kudos to AIHC, because they are very, very instructive. It's a great way of, getting people in a room for 30 minutes or 40 minutes who might otherwise not get into the room, and then talking about interprofessional, building that culture through the webinar, okay? And then we have conferences like Brazil and Jefferson. I could go on about the number of conferences. We have lots and lots and lots of them. But what's interesting is that this one's in Brazil, and this one's on the East Coast of the United States, and this one is going to be in Malaysia, and that one's going to be in Dublin. Oh, and by the way, there's a meeting in Amsterdam in January, and there's a meeting in Berlin in February. Oh, and isn't there a meeting? Can you remember when we didn't have one meeting? The first meeting was the first meeting. Think of the culture that this is building, and why it's hard to get the quant data that the cynics and the skeptics ask for when we're only at this stage in building the culture. Very exciting was the development of newsletters. So this is there's one from Jefferson. This one is from Cotter, and that one's from my colleagues at the University of Toronto. The newsletter has proved to be a very interesting way to reach people who just kind of say, oh, what's this in my mailbox? Because you jazz up the 2 lines so that it doesn't look like it's something to sell you insurance. You put it, when we have an opportunity in these newsletters to tell the story, we have to be sure that the story can be read by people who only have a grade 8 education. So I love newsletters as a dissemination tool, and I think that just those who are involved in producing them are dedicated to the culture. Just think about what it takes to put together a newsletter. It's not something you just do overnight, okay? So these newsletters, and there are more, so don't feel offended that I'm not talking about your group or because honestly, we could have 1,000 slides. No, not quite 1,000, but the newsletter, again, building the culture in another dimension. So remember I said that the questions were not really linear, they're overlapping, because you can see now where the overlapping is taking place and how the culture is picking up bits that are building the puzzle, that are making it what it is. And this is from Jefferson, very interesting look at the organizational growth of their interprofessional program. It was 10 years old last year. And so they've looked at, how many people have entered the curriculum, how many publications, and we need the centers now to be doing more of this, okay? To be reviewing, to do the evaluation, to review the data of those people who are now engaged. Because this becomes a different kind of data, but a very important source of data. Because when you read the 4 claims made by my 2 colleagues at the University of Toronto, IPE is logistically complex and costly. Tell me about education in this profession and this profession. Is it not also logistically complex and costly? You can't just lay this on IPE. I'm a glass half full. In fact, I'm the president of an organization worldwide called Hopeaholics Anonymous. Join me. IPE is developmentally inappropriate. We're not there. You can't say that yet. You can't say it's development. We're less than 20 years old. How can you say we're developmentally inappropriate for such a young organization of an academic discipline? You can't say that. And you can't do it by looking at 4 articles that say, yeah, actually this worked. Because we've not yet put through large enough cohorts of students in every program in interprofessional education that we can do the measures that say, yeah, they did learn with, from, and about each other, and you can look at the way in which they collaborate, and if you look at the end of the line, you can see that the quality of care has been improved. You can't say it's developmentally inappropriate this time. Rarely addresses parent, oh, give me a break. How are you going to capture that at the moment when we don't have an anthropologist looking at us? We don't have a political scientist looking at us. We have sociologists. Scott was incredibly good at this. But those other academic disciplines are ones that we need to bring on board in order that we can address this question. So you can't say we're looking at all kinds of stuff. Until we recruit those academics into looking at parent conflict. But if you look at the parent conflict issues around establishing a center, establishing a professorship, establishing a whatever, you can see the power in the faculty of medicine as opposed to the cleaning guy down at the bottom of the pole. So power and conflict is there. But we haven't addressed it yet because, as I said, we haven't had a big enough cohort growth rate system. Healthcare is an inertial system that is unlikely to change. Now, let me tell you. We have a healthcare system in Canada that's about 70 years old. The same is true in the United Kingdom. The United States is a bit different. Australia is interesting. New Zealand is a bit different. But you think about the provision of healthcare for the population across a huge range now of systemic and anatomical disturbances. It's only been around for like 70 years. Of course it's going to be a little difficult to change because it's the most highly educated workforce in the world. And we suffer from ego. So inertia is going to be in the system regardless, all right? That has nothing to do with IPE. It's just that as we try to keep adjusting the system to meet the needs and the wants of patients, clients, customers, whatever the next one is, I can never remember what the Brits call it. But anyway, when you think about the origin of the healthcare system in the United Kingdom through Nye Bevan and then in Canada, the origin was to meet the need that was huge in the population. Because remember, there were a lot of people who couldn't afford any kind of medical care, any kind of health care, but medical care at that time. So when you think about that and you think about as we have accumulated more and more health occupations, in Canada, Stats Canada has 70 health occupations in its record. The United States has more than 200. So think about want. So then, of course, the patient, client, customer says, oh, well, you know, I really want you to do an MRI. Remember all this stuff? Well, we have had a huge discussion about it, but really want, and then you say, want, I'm not sure that a system like this can actually do anything for your wants. We're here to do something about your needs. So the inertial system that is healthcare, I don't think anything's likely to make a huge change because it's Knight's move. Some of you heard my little talk about, you know, it's always Knight's move, 2 to the side, 1 to the front, 1 to the side, 2 to the front, etc. Healthcare system is always going to be like that. Just think of the problem of wait lists for surgery. I don't know how many ministers of health in my country kind of think they've got their handle on the access system for the wait list, and you say, oh, yeah, I think we've got a great system to handle the wait list. And then, lo and behold, somebody gets flattened on the concrete, and in they come, and the place that's been reserved for you is now taken up by them. And you say, but I've been waiting for 6 months for this surgery. Well, actually, we got to fix somebody else up. Okay? So need and want, huge issues. But we're going to have this problem. Now, let me just end with a couple of generalizations. Bill Gates said, we overestimate the change that will occur in 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. This is so true of our academic pursuit. If you think back 10 years, none of us, I would think, would have said we would be as far forward as we are now. So look at the numbers. I think in 1998, when we were in the church house, we probably had less than 1,000 around the world engaged in what it is that we're engaged in here. By 2008, my guesstimate is we had about 10,000. I think now, if I do a very conservative back of the envelope number on all of the things I've been talking about this morning, we're probably up to 200,000. That's a pretty reasonable number. And if we think forward another 10 years, you'll get another multiple that'll be much bigger. Because we're building the culture. Not because we're doing Beamies and Cochranes, et cetera, but because we're doing that vital piece of putting in place all the components that are really necessary to build a culture from which we can then get that data. And I hope you like my upside-down map. You think that New Zealand's very important, so we put it at the top, right? You know, we're very arrogant in North America. We always show it the other way around. I thought we should have the upside-down one. Okay. Now, when we were in Lund for Altogether Better Health, we were very, very privileged to have the late, great Hans Rosling give us a very short but wonderful, wonderful kind of YouTube event. Hans Rosling, one of my heroes, and maybe he's one of your heroes. He was incredibly smart about data. And if you haven't read it, I do recommend his book written with his son and daughter-in-law called Factfulness. And take the test at the front of the 10 questions. Actually, you don't even need to buy the book to take the test. You'll be surprised, like I was, of how ignorant I am of some things that are patently full of fact, okay? But he said, keep track of gradual improvements, which is what I've been trying to give you today, the gradual improvement. Keep track, because a small change every year can translate to a huge change over decades. It's so true. These little changes that we've been making have been building into much bigger changes. And then his son says, you have to realize that development takes 100 years. It does. It's not going to happen in 10. You know, people used to say, well, you know, when are you going to do this? When are you going to? I said, we're not going to do it yet because we just don't have enough people in place. This is new. The little changes. Keep track of the little, in your life, you know, about what you're doing for IB. Write down each week something that you think is a little change that is on the positive side of the scale. Thank you for your attention, all my relations. Sure.
Okay, well, we do have time for a couple of questions or comments if people want to make them. I'm holding one of the box microphones ready to fire at someone. I know that Jill Thistlethwaite especially wanted to have one of these thrown at her, so be careful what you wish for.
And I'm quite happy for comments as opposed to questions. Thank you, Jill.
I actually can't see you, but Roger, I can see you.
Roger.
So.
I really just want to say how remarkable that is. And for me, thinking about the development of culture, I think we should provide this to everyone as a next Christmas present. But that was really quite superb. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Jones from the Gold Coast. I think with IPE, a bit like cultural awareness training, as we learn more about, we're just describing what's good clinical practice. And there's nothing particularly... it's special because it breaks it down into what constitutes good clinical practice. And I think and everyone does have a very similar viewpoint across the professions about what constitutes.
Yeah. We're not going to kill the patient deliberately. Yeah. That's for sure.
There you go, Jill. No, Jill, you deserve to have it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John, for making me feel optimistic again. Because I have this feeling that we're in the end times of something, I don't know quite what. And it's quite interesting about health systems not changing and inertia, because I think it depends what we mean by change. Having spent a lot of my first part of my professional career in the NHS is always changing. And sometimes it changes for the better and sometimes it changes for the worse. And the best experience of interprofessional collaboration I ever had was in a general practice in Yorkshire when there was a specific type of funding model within the NHS, and it was absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And then the funding model changed and the whole thing fell apart. So I think things can change. It's how we move the leadership, and I said this yesterday, you know, because in Australia, we're hampered in interprofessional practice by the funding model to the practitioners, and we need to get rid of item of service payments, and I'm not sure how we're going to do that. We keep changing our Prime Minister and nothing else seems to change, so that's what so that's what I mean by, what do we mean by change? You know,
so
anyway,
it reminds me of Lord Salisbury. I think it was Salisbury who was a minister. I think maybe he was the Prime Minister in England. And they were going through some rough times, and one of his aides comes to him and says, well, you know, I think we need to have some change in the... He said, change? Who wants change? Don't we have enough trouble as it is? So yeah, I mean, change is it's a big problem, for sure.
Well, thank you very much, John.
Hi, Liz.
Again, picking up on Jill's point for the positiveness of what you've said, can I just say that I think that to go forward in the way that we have has been tough for many people, and the resilience of this international group should not be underestimated. For most of us that are with you working, for me, with CAPE and with Hugh in the UK, for every step we've taken forwards, we've sometimes had to take 10 backwards. And I think something needs to be said about the resilience and the wonderful commitment of this global movement.
Yeah. No, I agree. We could have, of course, an entire session on resilience and what has constant. And that was something that came up as I was thinking about this, because clearly I've been thinking about these issues for quite a long time. But resilience is a very interesting concept, and when you think about how important it is that we are resilient in this group in order to carry them out. I agree, Liz. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll throw it
there's
up.
one question at the back, and we need to get this up too. So can you pass it up?
If I remember, you have a pretty loud voice anyway.
Hey there. Great throwing arms there. Barbara Maxwell here. I just want to say thanks to John for doing something which I think we really need to do in the interprofessional space, and that's change the question. We're asked all the time, does it work? It's not an it. No. It is many things, and the sense of it being a culture, something different. I think you've set a platform for reframing what it is And we really need to do that. We need to stop knee-jerking to, does it work, does it work, does it work? And we need to have more conversations about what it is. So thanks.
That was a touchdown.
Question.
Yes, so
Okay.
Give him 3 points.
sign her up. Yeah. Good job, Barbara. Alan Dow, Virginia Commonwealth. So great talk. One of the things that I wonder about is that I see lots of great examples of interprofessional practice that are out there but are not labeled as interprofessional. So a good example is all the pharmacy chronic disease management in the US. We see a primary care that just completely meets the AAA, and the patients love it, the health outcomes are better, and the costs are less. But it's not often labeled interprofessional, and so it doesn't get picked up in systemic reviews and things like that, systematic reviews. So how much should we be working to make sure that these things are labeled as interprofessional, even though that we recognize that they are great examples of interprofessional care?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, thanks. What I have observed is that once what you have described is in place and somebody hears the word, it actually gets translated back into that space so that it now becomes interprofessional. There are a number of instances I didn't put up today, but which I found when I was looking for some specifics. So you actually see there's an awareness that grows, and people say, oh, what we're doing is really interprofessional, so maybe we should call it interprofessional, and they do call it interprofessional. So I don't think you can actually stamp them with the badge. They've got to get there themselves, and they do. So, but it's a very interesting observation. Thank you.
Okay, Roger, the last question.
No, let's have.
Wait on.
We've got one more here.
Yes, if it's the last question, please take some.
Sure. Okay, it is the last question.
But you're not the last question. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Margot.
Yeah, we need Margaret to ask a question.
I'm from Perth, West Australia. I think one of the things as well that interests me, again, about that call for evidence is certainly in the health profession related to, they're not measuring the impact of their specific education on health outcomes. And when you look in that Frank report, that we spend $100 billion US on health professional education, but in general, the health of the community is cutting out. I think the battery's going flat. In general, the community's health isn't getting better. So as much as there's a call for evidence around the interprofessional education, particularly in university, makes a difference to health, I don't think we're tracking evidence that health professional education is making a difference to health outcomes. Much in the same way, the other argument to push back I often get is if we train our students in this way, in interprofessional working, and that's not what they see in the community, then what's the point? And it makes me think about the fact that there's a lag between evidence-based practice and it reaching practice. So do we have the same argument that there's no point teaching our students evidence-based practice because it's not what they're going to see when they get out there? And it's just this funny way of thinking about things like interprofessional education in a different way to how we're thinking about the rest of health professional education.
Yeah, well, as usual, Margot, you're asking me 9 questions. But, let me come back to my answer to Liz, and that is we have not put cohorts through the process that is the definition, right? So there is no evidence until we put them through the process. And we've got to do that because otherwise, what's the point of having the definition? So I agree with you, but until we've kind of got the folks on campus to understand that the Gilbert 60-40 rule is 60% out there, 40% there. Think about the 60%. Don't give too much to the 40%. But until we put the cohorts through, we're not going to get that. In the same way as we have now about 20 PhDs that have been focused on IPE. A few of them are here today. And we have to build that side of things as well. Anyway, good stuff. Roger? You get the last question.
I think it's flat, but I'm not sure. No, it comes in and out.
Right, John, just one comment, and it goes back to the question posed a few moments ago. I mean, it seems to me, and certainly when I'm thinking about the development of interprofessional education and practice, I really want to locate that as a part of a larger development which is about partnership, collaboration, co-production. It's a global movement in which interprofessional is one significant dimension. And I wonder what your thoughts are about, in a sense, recognising that we're part of something actually bigger and more diverse that is working at building cultures of collaboration, connection, etc.
So I have a cartoon from the New Yorker, and it goes like this. It's about the 15th century. There's a guy standing with a pointed hat on and a telescope, and he's looking up at the sky. And there's a little guy next to him who's looking up at him. And the punchline is, I've worked out that something goes around something, but I don't know quite what it is yet. That's about as far as that's a huge question. We have to have a whole seminar on that one. Thank you very much, everybody.
So all it remains to do now is to thank John very, very much. I think you will agree that he is not just a practitioner of the art of oratory, but he is a master of oratory. To be able to weave the past, the present and the future together into a new and complex tapestry, not a linear progression, but a multi-layered, rich fabric, and excite us, inspire us, and as Jill said, actually give us hope and optimism. That's no mean feat. A big thank you, John. We have so enjoyed your work.
Thank you.